Welcome to the DOR. How much do you know about the history and foundations of the Department of Rehabilitation? Whether you're a new employee or have been with the department for some time, welcome to the DOR Part 1, History and Foundations, will provide you with a thorough introduction to the department's history and mission, including the history of the rehabilitation movement and key pieces of rehabilitation-related legislation from World War I to today. Let's take a look at our mission statement. The California Department of Rehabilitation works in partnership with consumers and other stakeholders to provide services and advocacy resulting in employment, independent living, and equality for individuals with disabilities. So what is it we really do? What is our product? In a sense, you might say that our product is the people we serve, the individuals with disabilities who seek our help. But it's important to remember we are not an entitlement program. An individual must apply for and be determined eligible for services from the DOR. The consumer we serve is someone who wants to work and comes to us in a spirit of partnership. They want change in their life, and the DOR is the instrument for the change they seek. 2013 was a big year for the DOR. The department was established in 1963, making 2013 its 50th anniversary. Today, the DOR is the largest vocational rehabilitation program in the country, serving more than 100,000 Californians with disabilities. We have more than 80 locations statewide, from the northernmost part of the state in Crescent City to the southernmost part of the state in Imperial and San Diego counties. Central office, DOR's headquarters hub, is in Sacramento, while field offices are scattered all around the state. DOR operations are regulated by the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 as amended and administered by the Rehabilitation Services Administration, otherwise known as RSA. The DOR is also governed by state regulations as codified in the California Code of Regulations, or CCR. To fulfill its mission of providing advocacy and assistance to individuals with disabilities, the DOR provides a long list of services. At the heart of our services is counseling and guidance, as DOR's vocational rehabilitation teams partner with consumers to help them reach their employment goals. In addition, DOR provides referrals for services from other agencies, on-the-job or personal assistance services, interpreter services, supported employment, and assistive technology, including such things as hearing aids and screen readers. All of these services are delivered with our 5 core values in mind, which include quality, to meet stakeholders' needs through continuous improvement, competence, creativity, and teamwork; respect, to be sensitive to the diverse needs of others by being courteous, compassionate, responsive, and professional; integrity, to act in an ethical, honest, and professional manner in all endeavors; openness, to be willing to listen to and share information with others, and to be open and receptive to new ideas; and accountability, to take ownership and responsibility for actions and the results of those actions. By adhering to our core values in the way we do business, the DOR continues to sustain its position as a respected leader in the disability community. And on a very human level, we inspire hope in those we serve. When a consumer applies for services, how does the DOR decide who to serve and in which order? The first order of business is to determine a consumer's eligibility for services, or lack thereof. If a consumer is eligible for services, he or she is determined to be in one of 3 categories: most significantly disabled, or disabled. This rating system is known as the order of selection, which is exactly what it sounds like. It determines the order in which individuals will receive services, with those in the first category, most significantly disabled, on top of the list with highest priority. Once an individual begins receiving services, it is the DOR counselor who plays the primary role in helping the individual to achieve a successful employment outcome. A key piece of that process is the IPE, Individualized Plan for Employment, which is accomplished through a joint effort between counselor and consumer. That joint effort is referred to as informed choice. Informed choice refers to the fact that consumers are responsible for fully participating in all aspects of the plan, and that the IPE is the result of their partnership with their counselor and the rest of the VR team. And speaking of the team, while the DOR's counselors maintain primary responsibility for leading consumers through the VR process, it is now a team approach thanks to the department's new Vocational Rehabilitation Service Delivery Team model known as VRSD. VRSD is a team-centric approach to VR services in which counselors work in conjunction with employment coordinators, service coordinators, office technicians, and managers to respond to the consumer's needs each step of the way. This new team service model, known as VR Mod, short for VR Modernization, represents a huge shift in the way business is conducted at DOR. And as it turned out, the timing of this new team model, as well as the department's new and much improved computer system for case management called AWARE, coincided with the department's 50th anniversary as statewide implementation began in January 2013. While working at the DOR, you may frequently hear terms like successful closure and successful outcomes. At DOR, such terms usually refer to one thing and one thing only: the consumer landed a job. Since DOR's main mission is to help consumers find gainful employment through the VR process, there is no happier ending for the organization, or, more importantly, for the individual. But the only way for you to get a true sense of these happy ending stories is to witness them for yourself. So we're going to take a minute to show you 2 short videos of consumers who came to DOR for help and found their way back into the workplace. And yes, these are true stories. First, we'll look at the story of Tracy, who had a stroke and could no longer do her original job.
My name is Tracy Leola. I work for Dreamcatchers Empowerment Network, and I am an employment specialist. We work with people that have all different types of disabilities, and we work hand in hand with DOR to get them prepared to work in the community. I had a stroke in 2004. I did not enjoy staying home at all. I felt the need to give back. I had actually have over 20 years of management experience in the healthcare field. I went to an orientation at the Department of Rehabilitation. One of the first steps that the counselor wanted me to do was to go to the occupational evaluation. There were just areas I could not perform. I was working with a speech therapist for several months. I was working with physical therapy with, walking and balance. There were points when I was testing that I would break down and cry. The most important thing that I believe I learned through DOR was that I can work. There was a point in time where I was questioning all of my abilities. Am I able to do what I did previously? No, I don't believe I can. My counselor set up an on-the-job training program, an OJT. My Department of Rehabilitation counselor recognized that I had a lot of the abilities for this. She knew my medical background well enough to know that I could do this. It's worked wonderfully. We went out in the field and we did job development. I'm learning something new every day. It stimulates my brain, and that helps me a lot medically. Employment is important to me because it gives me the feeling that I'm contributing. It keeps my brain active, it keeps me active. Independence is important to me because I've been told many times I couldn't, and I have. There have been many times I was told I would not succeed, I would not walk, I would not do certain things, and it brings out the fight in me. We're helping people like me get back into the workforce and get back on their feet and going. And I enjoy working. I thrive on it.
In the next video, we'll see how the DOR helped Hector, a visually impaired consumer, to find a job.
My name is Hector Elias, and I currently work for Social Security. Actually, I'm coming up to 2 years working with them in June. I had grown up in a family where I was the only blind person. Well, and even that, I wasn't essentially blind. I was visually impaired to a degree where I wasn't really accepted in the blind community because I wasn't blind and I wasn't fully sighted. And when I started with DOR was back in 2003, right before I was graduating from high school. We started talking about what is it that I wanted to do. And, I was fresh out of high school, and one of the biggest things for me was getting educated. At that point, I felt like in my life, I needed to become something more than just having a career for myself, but rather to become someone that would see the difficulties that I went through in my own life and try to make a change for others. I couldn't do it alone. And this is where DOR actually became a big help for me to learn to know the law. What is it that I need to do and what are my rights, but also what resources are available for me to get where I need to get. When I started, I felt like I needed to do everything. Just tell me how to do it and I'm going to do it. And then you get overwhelmed, your plate gets full, and then what? You're sitting there and you're saying, well, it feels like I have so much to do, but I'm not getting anywhere. Rather than say, well, this is what my plan is. This is what I want to do. How do I get there? And DOR actually played an important part for me because they actually did the mock interviews. We discussed on maybe how to dress appropriately for the interview. How do I build a resume? So when I do go to a job interview, everybody's going to see that I can do the job and I could be self-supportive, and whatever I don't know, there's other people that do. And that's where the team comes in. And all these different agencies or even your family, they all work together to make you independent. And you start realizing that through this effort from everybody, you become more independent than rather than being stubborn and saying, I want to do it just on my own. One day I want to own my own home. One day I probably would have my own family. And allowing me to, enter the workforce and participate in the workforce is going to allow me to do that. I travel. I also do rock climbing. I do hiking, swimming, anything. I'm not afraid to try anything. Whatever hasn't been tried, there's probably a way to modify it. It's not that I'm, trying to climb Mount Everest. It's not that I'm purposely picking up a goal and say, I'm going to overcome this just to show I can. All I'm trying to do is be me. I'm just trying to live my life. And through whatever everyday thing that I do, if people see that it's an amazing thing, to me, it's really just something that needs to be done, like going to work. I'm really open to anything now. Yeah, I think I have basic fundamentals of what I can and cannot do that, pretty much the world is open to me. It's just a matter of having that opportunity to go out there and explore it.
So now that you've seen these videos, hopefully you have a better sense of the very important work we do here at DOR. Now it's time for a little historical perspective. As we take this short tour through rehabilitation history, you may gain a whole new appreciation for how far we've come as a country and a society when it comes to disability laws and practices. Going back to early colonial America, the country's energies were devoted mainly to survival. Laws in the 13 colonies excluded settlers who could not demonstrate an ability to support themselves independently. In fact, immigration policy forbade people with physical, mental, or emotional disabilities to enter the country. Sadly, such stigmas still exist, but we have grown in our understanding of disability. Our attitudes have changed and have become more founded in reason rather than superstition and assumption. Here are a few telling examples of the way persons with disabilities were viewed and treated prior to the 1900s. Pay close attention to the language that was used to describe individuals with disabilities. In 1722, the Connecticut House of Corrections was established to confine criminals and those with disabilities. 1863, the Hospital for the Ruptured and Crippled was established in New York. Such terminology is clearly not acceptable today, but sadly, attitudes were entirely different in those days. Here are a few more examples that illustrate early attitudes toward individuals with disabilities. In 1880, the U.S. Census combined for reporting purposes defectives, delinquents, and dependents. This method of lumping together these three groups provides a clear and shocking demonstration of the way individuals with disabilities were harmed by rampant and negative social stereotyping. In 1893, the Boston Industrial School for the Crippled and Deformed was established. Though the terms crippled and deformed would today be considered offensive, in truth, this school was an altruistic mission, as it was founded by two orthopedic surgeons from Boston's Children's Hospital who were concerned about the educational opportunities available at the time for the children they served. Presumably, they saw no fault with the words they used. In their minds, they were probably just being direct. Thankfully, we've come a long way since then, and the language used to describe individuals with disabilities has changed through the years as society has progressed. The topic of disability etiquette, including appropriate terms to use when speaking to and about individuals with disabilities, will be covered in depth in Part 2 of Welcome to DOR. As we talk about the path that legislation has taken through time, it may be helpful to ask yourself a few questions. For example, what was going on in our country politically just before these laws were introduced? What was the political bent of the nation at that time? What was going on socially? Was there a war? Was it a peaceful period? Was there prosperity or economic hardship? What was the social environment for the majority of the population? How were people with disabilities being viewed at that time in history? How were they valued as individuals?
Around the turn of the century, there were signs that things were about to improve for individuals with disabilities. One of the most encouraging signs, and the biggest strides, was the coming of workers' compensation. In 1908, America's first workers' compensation law was passed in Massachusetts, followed by California's adoption of workers' comp in 1911. Other states followed. Workers' compensation was the precursor to the vocational rehabilitation movement, and things kept improving from there. In 1917, the Smith Hughes Act was passed. This act provided federal money to the states on a 50-50 matching basis for vocational education. It came in response to organized labor's need for vocational education programs as large numbers of unskilled rural youths migrated into the cities looking for work. There was also a need to retrain dislocated industrial workers with limited skills. At this point in 1917, vocational education was not yet associated with disability or rehabilitation. Industrial injuries were being handled by the workers' compensation laws. Individuals born with disabilities or later acquiring disabilities through illness or non-industrial accidents were taken care of by friends, family, and charitable institutions. The Soldiers Rehabilitation Act of 1918 came in response to the need to retrain wounded soldiers returning from World War I. The Federal Board for Vocational Education was given the primary responsibility for developing a vocational program for veterans of all wars with military service-related disabilities. If an injured veteran wanted to return to work, the vocational rehabilitation plan had to pass a feasibility test. Industry had changed in America post-World War I, and new types of jobs were emerging that were less physically demanding. For example, many veterans with disabilities were rehabilitated into jobs as drafting professionals, pharmacy technicians, bookkeepers, and other work that was not physically demanding. So, to recap, at this point in 1918, workers' compensation was providing help for those with industrial injuries, and veterans with disabilities and displaced industrial workers were being vocationally re-educated under federal law. But there was still no vocational rehabilitation public program for those who were born with or acquired a non-industrial or non-military related disability. The signing of the Vocational Rehabilitation Act of 1920 was a huge turning point. Also known as the Smith Hughes Act, Public Law 236, this law provided funds for vocational guidance, training, occupational adjustment, prosthetics, and placement services for civilians with physical disabilities. Within 18 months of its passage, 34 states, including California, passed legislation to develop a program of services that could accept federal funds available to them on a 50-50% matching basis. The primary responsibility for administration of this act was assigned to the Federal Board of Vocational Education as administered by individual states. While this act was clearly a huge stride for the disability community, it had one downside. While it protected and provided services for individuals with physical disabilities, it did nothing to help those with mental illness or developmental disabilities. Still, it was a step in the right direction. Between 1921 and 1933, the country was recovering from World War I. The stock market crashed, the Dust Bowl occurred, and the Great Depression began. As a result, not a whole lot of attention was given to developing social policies for individuals with disabilities. But in 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt became president, and guess what? He was an individual with a disability. 2 years later, under FDR's leadership, the Social Security Act was passed, and as part of that act, vocational rehabilitation was made a permanent program. Whereas at one time it had to be reauthorized every 4 years, that was no longer necessary. Vocational rehabilitation also became forever linked with Social Security. Social Security also led to Voc Rehab's association with other programs, such as the Ticket to Work program and the Workforce Investment Act, or WIA. In the late 1930s, progress continued its slow and steady climb for individuals with disabilities. In 1936, the Randolph Shepard Act established a federal program that gave blind individuals a chance to operate vending stands on federal property. Down the road, this act became the basis for DOR's Business Enterprise Program, or BEP. BEP accepts a small number of legally blind students each year and provides them with training and employment opportunities in the management of food service and vending facilities on public and private properties throughout the state. The BEP also promotes and develops new locations in public and private buildings for vending and food service operations. In 1938, the Wagner O'day Act expanded opportunities for individuals with blindness by requiring the federal government to purchase certain products from workshops for the blind. As a result of U.S. involvement in World War II and troops leaving to fight overseas, there was a need to replenish the labor force as positions became vacant. There was a political, social, and economic need to get as many people into the labor force as possible. As a result, the public again started thinking about which kinds of work could be performed by individuals with disabilities. Women, too, became bigger players in the labor force as millions of them took jobs that were left behind by the servicemen who had gone off to war. In 1943, individuals with disabilities once again benefited with the passage of the Barton-La Follette Act, which expanded services to the blind. But individuals with blindness were not the only beneficiaries. This act also expanded the types of physical restoration services that could be provided to individuals with mental illness and mental retardation. This single shift gradually led to a doubling of the number of vocational rehabilitation consumers, and as Voc Rehab services became more and more mainstream, some of the negative stereotypes surrounding individuals with disabilities began to soften. People began to realize that people with disabilities were capable of much more than they had previously thought. But what about all of those servicemen returning from the war with injuries? How were they helped? Thankfully, it was around this same time that Dr. Howard Rusk established the first physical rehabilitation occupational medicine facility at New York University, NYU, Medical School for the purpose of rehabilitating injured soldiers. And even beyond NYU, sympathy for the heroes of World War II created some very strong advocates for expanding federal support of rehabilitation services. As support for individuals with disabilities continued to grow, so did the kinds of services that were available to them. Some of these new services included cataract surgery, bone surgery, hearing aids, and wheelchairs. In addition, states began to create separate rehabilitation agencies for people with vision issues. In 1954, a new set of vocational rehabilitation amendments were signed into law. The 1954 amendments represented a major expansion of the amount of federal funding to states. The 50-50 amount of federal-state match increased to a ratio of 3 to 2, meaning 3 federal dollars for every 2 state dollars. Services to individuals with mental retardation and psychiatric disabilities were further expanded. The law authorized research and demonstration grants, extension and improvement grants, and funds for facility development. This increased federal funding eventually led to the beginning of the National Institute on Disability Rehabilitation Research, NIDR, to set up a clearinghouse of information and research. Doctors learned to treat more disabilities too. In addition, grant funding became a reality for colleges that offered vocational rehabilitation programs to train counselors and professionals to work in the VR field. The 1950s were a prosperous time, and investing money in vocational rehabilitation was viewed as not only a socially moral program, but also a cost-effective return on investment. VR helped thousands find work, making it politically and socially popular, and the numbers proved the program was successful. On average, VR consumers returned $7 in taxes on every $1 spent on training. To sum it up, the 1950s were a robust time for the forward movement of vocational rehabilitation. VR had proved so successful that it led to the Rehabilitation Act Amendments of 1965, which were signed into law as part of Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society program. This was a time of sweeping legislative changes in which a number of new programs and initiatives were erected in an effort to address education, racial injustice, poverty, the environment, and health care, among other issues. Thankfully, what this meant for the rehabilitation community was increased funding from a ratio of 3 to 2 federal to state dollars to a ratio of approximately 3 to 1. In addition, the 1965 Rehabilitation Act Amendments allowed for many services to be provided prior to formal acceptance into the program. It eliminated the financial need requirement and expanded eligibility to a new category called behavior disorder. Disability was redefined to include drug abuse, alcoholism, repeated jail sentences, behavior disorders, public assistance, and other non-medical conditions. It also made it possible to set up the Model Cities programs to work with the socially disadvantaged. The upshot? Where VR had once served thousands of people, it now served tens of thousands. While this era of increased funding and expanded consumer services was such a boon for rehabilitation that it was referred to as the golden era of rehabilitation, there was also a downside. With such a dramatic upswing in available funding, huge numbers of new applicants threatened to overwhelm the system, making the rehabilitation process kind of a mass production event. Unfortunately, this sped up the rehabilitation process to a point where applicants were processed and evaluated perhaps too quickly. Services became less individualized and flexible. As a result of the system being overburdened, people with the most significant disabilities were lost in the shuffle. They needed the flexibility and individualized services they had enjoyed in the past. In response to the direction vocational rehabilitation was taking, a large group of individuals with disabilities became involved in what has become known as the disability rights movement. Modeled after the civil rights movement of the 1960s, this movement evolved in the late 60s and throughout the 70s and spoke out for social change for individuals with the most significant disabilities, such as cerebral palsy and spinal cord injuries. Disability advocates band together with a purpose and sophistication never seen before to demonstrate and lobby for legislation that would provide them a better say about who receives services and the type and quality of rehabilitation services to be provided. They felt that individuals with the most significant disabilities had been treated as separate but equal under the law for far too long. They wanted to put an end to separate programs and facilities, separate classrooms or schools for children with disabilities, and separate transportation services. People with disabilities demanded greater participation in the mainstream labor market and full inclusion in all aspects of society. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was the result of the unrelenting activism by disability rights groups. It had been previously signed into law and vetoed. The 1973 Act was a new law that addressed the idea of civil rights for individuals with disabilities. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 discontinued the behavior disorder eligibility category in favor of making the first priority that of serving severely disabled individuals. Consumer involvement was stressed by requiring the consumer to sign the Individualized Written Rehabilitation Plan, IWRP, and to be an active participant in the plan development, a feature that is still emphasized in Voc Rehab today. The Act also stressed program evaluation and continued support of rehabilitation research. It was a distinct change from the VR Act of 1920 that humbly asked the public to provide persons with disabilities equal access to employment and benefits of federally funded programs. Up to this point, there had been no federal law that could enforce the rights of people with disabilities. But the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 achieved this. It became mandatory under the law to provide equal access to individuals with disabilities to employment, transportation, education, and the benefits of all federally funded programs. It made clear that VR was to primarily serve people with the most significant disabilities and ushered in an era of close partnerships between counselors and consumers. In brief, this act was a huge victory for the rehabilitation community. Under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Title V incorporated civil rights protections for persons with disabilities. There are 9 sections numbered 501 to 509. Section 504 prohibits discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities in any federally supported program or activity. In addition, Section 504 regulations, along with Section 503, require employers to make reasonable accommodations for employees with disabilities unless the employer can show that the modifications required would impose an undue hardship on the operation of its program. One of the key players in the 504 victory was Ed Roberts. Ed was an American activist and the first student with severe disabilities to attend the University of California, Berkeley. He was a pioneering leader of the disability rights movement and played such a pivotal role in the 504 victory that January 23rd, his birthday, was declared Ed Roberts Day in the state of California by Governor Edmund G. Brown, Jr. Ed also has a very historical role here at the DOR, as he was appointed director of the department in 1975. The Ed Roberts Center on the UC Berkeley campus was built and dedicated in his honor.
The successes of the disability rights movement continued beyond the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 with further amendments in 1974, 1976, and 1978, with an emphasis on services to individuals with the most significant disabilities. The 1978 amendments provided for grant funds to support a separate independent living program. These concepts were integrated into the 1986 amendments. The Rehabilitation Act Amendments of 1986 focused mainly on the authorization of state rehabilitation agencies to provide supported employment services to individuals with significant or severe disabilities who could not traditionally be placed in competitive employment. It also reduced the emphasis of the traditional model of long-term placement in extended sheltered workshops. The Act mandated increased use of rehabilitation engineering services and established Client Assistant Programs, or CAP. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 is a wide-ranging civil rights law that prohibits, under certain circumstances, discrimination based on disability. Disability is defined by the ADA as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. The ADA has far-reaching effects, including providing equal employment opportunities to individuals with disabilities. To be more specific, it states that a covered entity, defined generally as an employer engaged in interstate commerce and having 15 or more workers, shall not discriminate against a qualified individual with a disability. This applies to job application procedures, hiring, advancement, workers' compensation, job training, and other terms, conditions, and privileges of employment. Clearly, the ADA was a huge victory not only for the disability community at large, but especially for agencies like the Department of Rehabilitation, whose purpose it is to help individuals with disabilities find employment and live independently. The Rehabilitation Act Amendments of 1992 strongly emphasized consumer involvement in the policies and procedures of state rehabilitation agencies and in choices regarding development of their rehabilitation plans. It established the State Rehabilitation Advisory Councils, with a majority of members being individuals with disabilities. It focused upon the importance of empowering people with disabilities to become fully involved in the development of their individualized written rehabilitation program, or IWRP, and encouraged consumer participation in annual reviews. The 1992 amendments also mandated minimum training standards for counselors and sped up the eligibility process, which was a boon to consumers. The amendments of the 1990s also ushered in the concept that agencies that serve individuals with disabilities, such as the Department of Rehabilitation, must presume that everyone with a disability can benefit from services. This means that individuals who were very significantly disabled could not be denied services, as they may have been in the past. The 1998 Workforce Investment Act, also known as WIA, and Rehabilitation Act Amendments combined rehabilitation legislation with more than 60 federally supported job training programs into 3 block grant areas: adult employment and training, disadvantaged youth employment and training, and adult education and family literacy. The purpose of these amendments was to provide a one-stop delivery system for individuals with disabilities who were seeking employment. This legislation continued to reinforce the concept of increased consumer choice and control of the vocational planning process. Another change that came by way of these amendments is that the term IWRP, Individualized Written Rehabilitation Program, was replaced by IPE, or Individualized Plan for Employment. This is the term still used today in DOR's work with consumers. The 1998 Workforce Investment Act requires partnerships between the public vocational rehabilitation system and other state and federal agencies providing employment-related services. It requires local cooperative agreements and provides flexible, individualized services to people with disabilities who need more than other job programs provide. The Olmstead Act of 1999 is not an amendment to the Rehab Act, but a separate law that resulted from a Supreme Court decision related to enforcement of Title II of the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. It requires that states place qualified individuals with mental disabilities in community settings rather than institutions whenever treatment professionals determine that such placement is appropriate. So, in summary, these are the founding principles of the work we do here at the Department of Rehabilitation. The first principle is that employment and productivity lead to independence. The second is that independence is the right of all American citizens, those with disabilities as well as those without. Another founding principle is that individuals with disabilities, including those with the most significant disabilities, are generally presumed to be capable of engaging in gainful employment. So whatever you do here at DOR, whether you're an office technician, a manager, a counselor, or a student assistant, you can feel proud in knowing that the highly professional rehabilitation services we provide are helping millions of individuals to find work, live independently, and reach their potential. It's important and rewarding work, and we thank you for your contributions.